Welcome to our way past due date ranking of Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree's bosses, the long-awaited DLC, which ended up being more like Elden Ring 1.5 than the normal couple extra areas, added many new and great fights to the iconic lineage of FromSoft bosses. In the finale of our Soulsborne boss ranking, expect these guys to show up there too, but for this video we'll be covering only the 13 Remembrance bosses from Shadow of the Erdtree, so no open world or dungeon bosses here. As always, thanks to our patrons for continuing to support us, and stay tuned as we begin ramping up content again. With all that said, let's get into the ranking.
Number 13, Golden Hippopotamus. You guys might have noticed that although we singled out Remembrance bosses for our ranking, there are only 12 of those, and there are 13 bosses in our video. Well, we added the Golden Hippo because he is mandatory, and I absolutely had to give my 2 cents on this fellow. The running trend for FromSoft's DLC is to cook up a veritable bonanza of incredible kino with one dreadful exception each time. Well, Shadows of the Erdtree is no exception to the rule. Fighting the Golden Hippopotamus is absolute eyeball-gouging torture, sure to make even the most rabid FromSoft meat riders dig their nails into their palms. Before I rip into him though, I should give FromSoft credit for fixing that ridiculous grab attack that he started the fight out with. I fought him before the patch, so I'm not quite sure how much better it is now, but that was probably my biggest issue with the fight, so good on them for doing that. If he somehow became dramatically less frustrating, good. But as it stands, I have a hard time imagining him being anywhere other than last place regardless, because the entire blueprint is rotten to the core. As I'm sure we can all agree, beast bosses are far more prone to being unpleasant due to their overwhelming propensity for command grabs and charge attacks, both of the most notoriously janky attack categories in action RPG canon. That's not to mention the challenges of making a functional camera able to withstand the urge to do the Harlem Shake whenever you get within 5 feet of the boss. As always, these factors come together and congeal like the ingredients of a putrid witch's brew to make for an experience that arouses nothing but discouragement and disinterest in continuing to play the game. Walking into the room and immediately throwing the entire fight because you were a picosecond too early and dodging directly into his gaping maw is the quintessential experience here. Should you survive the needlessly toxic introduction, he still relentlessly crowds your personal space like a Romanian in a train car. It's visually and mentally suffocating. All you can really do is spam jump attacks against an enormous slab of rectangular meat, and pray that it triggers staggers frequently enough to win you a DPS test. There is a second phase, which is cool, if only on the basis of them putting in some clear degree of effort, but for the same reasons described earlier, it's an inhuman slog nonetheless. I got fed up fighting it at Erdtree level 4 and ended up sodomizing him to death in a near flawless stunlock chain at like level 13, so even my final victory was slightly tainted by feeling as if I had deployed the Sar Bomba on a dust mite. I've seen it said that real-world hippopotamuses frequently kill nearby boaters with the size and velocity of their legendary diarrhea streams, which draws to mind an obvious comparison. Kudos to FromSoft for perfecting the art of immersion by making the most realistically miserable hippopotamus encounter in gaming since Mega Man 4.
Number 12, Commander Gaius. So, around April this year, I deleted TikTok because I could feel it affecting my everyday life. The first response my brain would come up with in any given scenario would be some brain rot word or an analogy to a TikTok I saw, and deleting it actually gave me some mental clairvoyance. But anyways, by getting rid of the app, I'm not really too aware of what's going on in the Elden Ring community there, except for one video Alex showed me. It was of some dude getting mauled by Gaius, captioned "Is FromSoft cooking?" and it had like 500,000 likes. And then after he showed me that video, as I figured out the maze of reaching Scadu View, Alex rightfully warned me about his rush attack and his hyper-aggression. That's not a good first impression. Though, to be honest, Gaius wasn't as bad as I was expecting. Maybe lowering my expectations mentally prepared me. Either way, once I actually started fighting him, I figured him out pretty quickly. This DLC gave me a newfound level of patience, although Gaius definitely pushed my limits in that regard. He only took me about 45 minutes to beat. Relative to the 11 hours Merlana took me, anything below an hour 30 seems like winning first try, but I still felt agonizingly frustrated by the minimal number of attack and healing windows present, as well as the questionable hitboxes that are quite common with Elden Ring's horseback fights. Wouldn't this technically be boarback, though? Maybe pigback? Hogback? I don't give a shit. I'm just mad the thing doesn't have a little, rear hole I can backstab. Because of all the different enemies in this series, this armored cut of pork is right up there as the most deserving of a weapon up the butt. And of the 2 armored boars in this series, Gaius' Canadian bacon slab is way more of a candidate than the random Dark Souls pig. I'm getting off topic, so to get back on track, my biggest complaint here by far is the hitbox on the ram attack. Like Golden Hippo's bite, it's ridiculous to have a move you can roll through and still be in its hitbox due to it taking so long to move past you. I know you can roll at the last moment, and if that is the only way to do it, then so be it, but as much as I enjoy challenging moves, this is utilizing iframes down to the millisecond, which I'm not exactly a fan of. Also, Gaius has some frankly illogical timings to his moves that exist to simply throw you off. It's easy to memorize 1 or 2, but when almost every attack is delayed to varying degrees, you kinda feel hopeless at times. The most egregious example is the opening move of his 5-hit combo, which is one of the only attacks that give you a big window once he finishes. That is, if he doesn't turn around right after and the boar kicks out at you, in which case you can't heal or attack and have to just get back on defense. I'm actually a fan of greed check moves, as you'll see later in this video, but when they're used as often and randomly as the kick, it pushes into the U-word territory. Unfair. Gaius' Phase 2 is more fun than his Phase 1 in my opinion, maybe because his moveset gets a little more unique and his bigger attacks like the corkscrew leave him more open. I'm also just a fan of multiple phases, and in this DLC where all the bosses have 25, 30, sometimes 40,000 plus HP, having something change over the course of the fight is almost necessary to keep the player fully engaged. In my winning fight, I did the Jack special where I got him down to 15%-ish health, had well over half my Estus left, and somehow managed to barely scrape out a victory. In my defense, the domino effect of me getting hit by everything started with his corkscrew, which was about 40 feet off target for whatever reason. I got a lot better at keeping my composure with Radahn, but here, I mean, it's just embarrassing. I went from 9 to 0 flasks in barely a minute. Luckily, I locked in for the 15 seconds I needed to and won, but man was Gaius a pain in the ass.
Jack already said everything of much note, but I'd like to add that I also hate this boss like I hate stubbing my toe and think everyone involved in designing him owes me financial compensation and a personal written apology. It took me back to my time fighting the horse-riding enemies in Ninja Gaiden Sigma, which is tantamount to setting off fireworks next to a sleeping Vietnam veteran. The disdain I hold in my heart for mounted bosses that aren't King Bulbin from Twilight Princess could power a nuclear reactor the size of a small moon, or even a big moon for that matter. Number 11, Putrescent Knight. This is a tough boss for me to talk about, because I respect what he's doing in a lot of ways, with the clearly intentionally bizarre attack rhythm and unique visual design being commendable, but I just happen to find him absolutely intolerably unfun to fight for one reason. My attacks straight up just couldn't hit him 90% of the time. I was using the Dryleaf martial arts, and literally nothing in my arsenal other than the weapon art could land a blow, because they'd go under him, whiffing straight into his goop horse's invulnerable gonads. Even those hits were mostly possible through hyper armor tanking through his moves, which is sort of odd. The result was a strangely turn-based RPG reminiscent encounter that felt comparable to Mortal Shell, which I should add I do not enjoy ever, and I will never cover it on this channel. That game sucks. It doesn't help that he's prancing around the whole time, so he's seldom in one place for enough time to counter him with anything substantial. The fire attacks and the ones where he separates from his horse were the only clean windows I could regularly exploit, so it felt like I was mostly just praying for good RNG more than learning the fight. His ranging is also frustrating to a scientific degree that makes it feel absolutely intentional. He fights me the same way I fight Melania, which is to say I run away like a coward the moment I get a hit in, which definitely aroused some sympathy for the devil in me. Maybe with different weapons I'd be able to look past the more trollish aspects and find some forgiveness in my stone, jaded heart, so I'm curious to hear testimonials from all of you guys to see if my issues were shared by anybody else. As it stands, I just can't grant this boss a pardon from my naughty list though.
Number 10, Mikola's Meat Riders. I can't wait to see Alex's opinions on this because I was there when he fought these dudes and it looked miserable. And then I went home, made it to them, and beat them third try. And really, First try. It was my only attempt where I didn't die to Freya during the 1v1. I'm always inclined to say a fight like this sucks because it's lazy or whatever, but this was surprisingly fun. For what this is, FromSoft did a really good job, and I'd say it's because of the wide range of NPCs, and with the NPCs summoning in at their own times instead of all at once, this feels like a real battle royale rather than a janky mess, which is probably what you'd expect a FromSoftware NPC 4v3 would be. It was interesting seeing the differences between Alex and I with his Ultra Greatsword strength build and my Dex build, as usually strength wins in terms of being better suited for Elden Ring's bosses, but with Mikola's Meat Riders, a term Alex coined for the record, as well as a lot of the other DLC fights, Dex builds seem to be a better fit. Yeah. Finally, I was getting blasted by just about every main game boss because I couldn't jump attack stagger them. On a final note, I think making the available NPCs only summonable by completing their side quests made it a lot more rewarding rather than the inverse. I won't talk about much else here because this is definitely a fight Alex is more opinionated on, but Dryleaf Dane deserved that 7,000 damage combo. Maybe next time don't try and fight a dude wearing a giant lion head, moron.
These guys have cool music, and I like how emotionally involved it all felt compared to the average FromSoft NPC questlines of yesteryear. Historically, they're all varying shades of playing hide and seek with the same guy enough times until he gets eaten alive and leaves his gear on the floor for you to pick up like you're a vulture plundering the organs of roadside carrion. Instead, you get to slide on an army with your slimes, Ansbach in particular being one of the most chill guys they've ever made. I generally like this fight, but there are two things I cringe at a little bit. First, the doubled loading times if you die, one to respawn and one to invade. A bit taxing on one's patience if you get pummeled on repeat like yours truly. That segs nicely into my second issue, Dryleaf Dane, whose bloodline I curse for eternity with all the ferocity that profound and directed hatred can muster. We need this guy on a sex offender registry ASAP. I haven't felt this violated since the guy next to me on an airplane tried using Angry Birds as a pretext to diddle me when I was like 7. He failed, by the way, but it was a close shave, long story. But the cherry on top is this hilariously embarrassing fail I had, where I cockily tried to wrap the fight up prematurely and sold with one hit between me and victory. Like, look at this, dude. Oh my god. And in the face of something like this, all you can really do is laugh. Not a fun boss in particular, but its non-gameplay factors make it at the very least better than the dregs. Number 9. Romina, Saint of the Bud. I've seen it said in a few places that one way the DLC dropped the ball a bit was the lack of cutscenes for some Remembrance bosses. Jack and I had a little chat about this in the car the other day, and it was sort of a back and forth. I personally think that the lack of cutscenes for major bosses makes them feel stripped of character and unique swagger, especially considering one of the most prominent common denominators among my favorite bosses in the series is having gnarly phase transitions or intros. Jack argued that overuse of cutscenes saturates the market, so to speak, and that it devalues or cheapens the rare occasions when they bust it out. I get that for sure, but I think a consequence of that approach is what harms Romina. I have no idea what on earth she is, or does, or represents at all, besides that she's related to the Scarlet Rot. Does she predate Melania, or even the ancient outer god that embodies the rot itself? I did my research. I looked a little bit online and found almost nothing that cleared up her identity or importance besides being a generic obstacle to kill. Most of the DLC bosses are either major players in the Elden Ring mythos or famously powerful beasts of yore, and Romina stands out as particularly random and haphazard. That said, she totally deserves better, since almost every other aspect of her fight rules. The music for her track, which many recognized from the trailer, is the best in the entire game in my opinion, if not the series. Romina herself has an awesome design with a color palette seldom seen elsewhere in these games and a flashy moveset much its own. Unfortunately, she's, kind of fodder from a challenge point of view. I think that's a big crux for where you rank her. Personally, I appreciated the brief reprieve from getting my gonads ground into paste, given it came as a package deal with an engaging spectacle of a battle. The butterfly move in particular was a real treat for the peepers, even if it's more bark than bite. I also really liked the little sound effect they gave that one move of hers with the flash. It's a very satisfying dodge cue that I enjoy using even if it significantly reduces the difficulty of the move. While her role in the story is something I'll likely only learn in 6 months when Vati Vidya gets around to making an 80-minute video on her, as a purely mechanical and spectacle-based foe, she earns her keep in my eyes.
Number 8. Rilana, Twin Moon Knight. I was hoping I could talk about Rilana. I don't hate this boss at all, but she made me feel lots of hate and rage, frustration, helplessness, defeat, agony, and a lot of other debatably synonymous words conveying negative emotions. And she even made me leave a message, the first time I've ever left one outside of Boss Arena. As I said in the Gaius segment, with no exaggeration, R'Lana took me just over 11 hours to beat. Is it a skill issue? Probably. Is it a boss issue? Yeah, somewhat. For me, R'Lana just crosses the line of aggression without equal opportunities of reprieve, a problem that other bosses of R'Lana's difficulty caliber, like DLC Radahn or Orphan of Kos, don't have. The thing is, there's no order with her. With Radahn, for example, without giving too much away from that script, following his stomp combo, I could retaliate with 2 hits every time. Following his corkscrew, I could do 2 hits every time. With R'Lana, following her cross slash for example, I could do a hit or 2, but she might also immediately jump into her 6-hit combo. I liked the way she kept me on my toes, but it felt, I don't want to say it, but unfair at times, especially with the number of close-range slashes and stabs that have moving and tracking hitboxes, and the sometimes undodgeable attacks, like the upward slash of her secondary 6-hit combo. I'm also not a huge fan of special moves not giving any chance for a response from you, something that's seemingly gone by the wayside since Dark Souls 3. Frankly, it sucks that R'Lana can use her huge moon attack and she doesn't even take 2 seconds to recover. Remember in Dark Souls when Smo would do his AoE and you can get in like 2 to 3 hits? I prefer that, even though I guess it does make fights a lot easier. The same thing goes for her other major moves like the sword, but at the same time, I don't care that much. They're cool as hell and even cooler to dodge. Anyways, I really like how dynamic R'Lana's combos feel. Because they can be anywhere from 4 to 8 hits, when you manage to perfectly dodge them, it's greatly satisfying. Even though the problems I previously mentioned are exacerbated in Phase 2 due to her swords gaining elemental buffs, her moveset does get a lot more fun. Her big attacks, like the Moon Slam, check your nerves, and I especially liked the opening, which can be either sorcery or pyromancy, although the fire one happened a lot less frequently for me. A big issue I struggled with in this fight as I looked over it again was rolling backwards. For most of these DLC fights, the direction you roll actually does matter, counter to basically any other boss in the entire series. Rolling backwards in the DLC is pretty much asking to get hit, and unfortunately for me, I never really figured that out until Radahn. So overall, I think if I was to refight R'Lana now, I would like her a lot more, and I'd definitely not take 11 hours to beat her. This is obviously an opinion swayed by a skill issue rather than the boss not being good, because I totally get people that love this fight. I just sucked ass at fighting her and paid the price for not getting good. Ultimately, the Sister of Rennala pushed me to my limits in a way no boss has ever done before, and for that, I respect her. She isn't perfect, but she is extremely challenging, and as such, is one of the most satisfying bosses I've had the pleasure of defeating.
I like this fight a lot, but it's in a similar boat to Romina for me, where the lack of cutscenes lends it a distinctly mini-boss-ish atmosphere that compromises the hype. In my head, and I'm willing to bet some of yours, she's basically methed out Pontiff Sullivan. That could be a good or bad thing depending on who you ask, but if nothing else, I'm sure we can all agree that she's a tough bastard and one of the last people you want to pull out a flask within 15 feet of. She also wants to marry her nephew, which is chill and normal. Number 7, Metter, Mother of Fingers. This is a real strange boss, both in structure and design. It's best described as a glass cannon with a health bar thin enough to inspire lofty delusions of a first-try victory and damage values high enough to send you crashing back to Earth. As far as the lore goes, I'm happy we got a Fingers-related boss and an explanation of what their deal was. Ymir did a great service with those lore drop monologues, at least until he got pissed at me for following his directions and went on a suicide charge. Metter has a gnarly body horror vibe going on that really speaks to me, and she earns bonus points for having thrashing limbs that aren't violently annoying, unlike a certain someone from Yar Ghul. The main move I remember giving me trouble was the giant laser, which felt borderline undodgeable but doesn't one-shot you or have a quick follow-up, so I just treated it as an Estus tax, the way Mog's phase transition move is. I just have a thing for strange bosses. I get the impression from talking to people that I'm one of its bigger fans. It's not like the Greater Will cares much about her either, it's too busy buying milk and cigarettes somewhere out in the cosmos. So with that in mind, I guess it falls to me to defend this boss as one of the better offerings of the DLC.
Number 6, Promised Consort Radahn. The notorious finale to Shadows of the Erdtree ended up being a surprise favorite boss in this series for me, something I think I should credit to Boss Fight Database. I've never done this before, but I heard so much about Radahn being insanely difficult that I felt like I just had to watch a YouTube video and see for myself. I relentlessly watched over footage of this fight, and it genuinely helped me internalize a lot of his movements before I even reached him. So, by the time I got there, I was ready. It took me only about 30 minutes before I pretty concretely figured out his phase 1, but that's also the child's play part of this fight. His phase 2 is without question one of the most difficult sequences in gaming history. Anyways, 1, that was like way too over dramatized. I did not mean to say it that way. But 2, I've seen tons of hate for Radahn online, and understandably, he's beyond description in terms of just how ridiculously hard he is, but I also have to argue that with a hefty amount of patience, anyone can do this. In essence, you don't have to be perfect to beat Radahn, but you have to be perfectly not greedy. What I mean is, every one of his moves has an exact counter, so it's just a matter of being quick to respond to them. In both phases, you can counter about half of his attacks. Obviously the major ones like the Death Star laser and the tactical nuke you can't do anything about, but a thing I notice a lot of people haven't realized is that a lot of his other notable moves are there to lead you on. They're setups that bait you into attacking him while he initiates a new combo. So, to help all you guys out a bit, the attacks you want to avoid countering are Blood Flame Slash, Starcaller Cry. On a side note, if he does pull you in, run backwards and jump twice and you won't get hit by the follow-up. Cross Slash, One-Handed Combo, Gravity Meteor, Quick Tip from Alex, sprint sideways and jump at the last second, and lastly, Sideways Ghost Slash. And now, the attacks you should retaliate against. I was a Dex build, so I might be able to attack more often than, say, a Greatsword build, but all of these attacks should, in theory, give every build time for at least one hit. Gravity Cyclone, Cross Slash Combo, Upward Slam, 4-hit combo, Swing Combo Variations, Lion's Claw, Miquella's Hug, Phase 2 Meteor Follow-Up, and lastly, the Holy Combo. So, that's pretty much what you do for Radahn. Easier said than done, obviously. But the nice thing about this fight is that even though Phase 2 introduces the lasers coming from the ground, if you're already practicing directional rolling in Phase 1, you won't get hit by them. And even if you do, with the golden braid found in the Shaman village, you basically won't take damage. Speaking of the lasers, I like Radahn's Phase 2 a lot more than most others seem to. Dodging his major attacks feels super awesome. As you know, if you mess up, you're dead. And the best thing about his second phase is that a good chunk of his moves are simply his Phase 1 attacks with lasers. If you manage to trick yourself into thinking that way, it gets a lot easier. Outside of the nerdy mechanics side of this fight, I love the way he looks and the theme. It's the best looking boss in Elden Ring in Mohg's body. Poor Mohg. It's also the same sort of thing as Malenia or R'Lana in that once you beat this fight, you get an overwhelming sense of joy and relief, and no matter how much you dislike a boss, you have to admit they're always a little better once you beat them. Unless it's something like the Black Rabbit Brotherhood from Lies of P. That fight just sucks. But anyways, my point being, if you're similar to me and actually like Radahn, he becomes even more enjoyable after you get over the hurdle of defeating him. While I love the majority of Elden Ring bosses, a reason why I hold Promised Consort Radahn in such a high regard is because, in the end, I hold total accountability on whether or not I live or die in this fight. I would immediately recognize when I'd make a mistake, and compared to a fight like R'Lana where often you feel duped by her speed and aggression, the difference in enjoyment, at least for me, was night and day. Promised Consort Radahn is in my mind one of the greatest boss fights ever made, and while for now the Elden Ring community seems fairly split on him, I think over time people will come to appreciate just how legendary this boss is.
I dig Radahn, but I don't love him. In a tier list I'd have him in A or something. I can appreciate some things about him, like the varied means of dodging his moves and the sheer scope of it all, but it's lacking an indescribable gameplay-related je ne sais quoi that some of the higher-up bosses have for me. I also don't like his design here as much as when he was cracked out on Scarlet Rot, which is too bad. Getting the orbital strike incantation does rule though, which is a hilarious move to have in your back pocket or even to bring out for kicks. I also appreciate that my glorious king, Mohg, Lord of Blood, finally beat the incestuous pedophile allegations, which had to have been taking a terrible toll on his mental health before he kicked the bucket. May he serve as a solemn reminder to never judge too hastily. Although that said, Miquella doesn't even look like a kid. I think the item descriptions were a bit misleading regarding his age. This whole time I thought he'd look like a 5-year-old or something, but he's gotta be like in his 20s, physically speaking. This is all coming from a 20-year-old who commonly gets mistaken for a 15-year-old though, so what do I know? Number 5, Erdtree Avatar. When I first saw there was a boss in this DLC called the Erdtree Avatar, I fell to my knees and let loose a groan of despair from the very bottom of my soul. I came into this expecting a normal tree avatar but with a Smash Bros. Palette swap. Instead, I got this strange, lanky, awesome beast of a boss. I absolutely adore this dude for so many reasons, even beyond the basic relief of him not sucking despite his name. For starters, his design is absolutely top-notch. I have an affinity for sunflowers in that I always thought they had a rather fascinating alien look to them, what with their height and tendency to grow in enormous fields closely packed together. Clearly, FromSoft is on the same wavelength, given they included them as far back as Bloodborne in arena design and world building, albeit as oppositely named lumen flowers. Then, of course, comes the actual fight itself. I was shamelessly jizzing my trousers when I first saw the damage I was doing in the first phase, and I can't call it anything short of genius to structure the fight the way they did. First, you get the fun of totally pummeling this frail, sickly flower giant, inspiring a catharsis similar to what you might feel in a rage room. Then, after seemingly putting him down, he comes back from the dead for God knows why. It totally fooled me the first time. I'd already pulled out my phone and was texting our server about what a fraud this guy was when I suddenly hear my character getting incinerated by laser beams. It took me a little bit to even understand what was going on, since my first thought was that I'd somehow left him with a sliver of health and put my controller down too early. But nope, there's a whole rematch with this guy, this time with a more normal health bar. And as if that wasn't funny enough, there's actually 3 of these phases, because why wouldn't there be? I knew better than to get cocky after killing the second one, but I still kicked the bucket a few times before taking him down for good. One thing I appreciated in general is that this boss is very different from the typical formula of one-on-one combat that people often compare to a dance. Here, you have way more freedom in how you go about things than usual, since very few of the moves stagger you out of attack animations and the downtime between moves is strangely charitable. The Erdtree Avatar is a perfect blend of originality and mechanical fluency, which I believe puts it on the same level as some of the other greats in this category of boss, like the Guardian Ape and the Old Ivory King, which is to say bosses that are somewhat unorthodox but are not quite gimmick bosses the way I would define it.
Number 4, Divine Beast Dancing Lion. For a first boss, this was nuts. I somehow beat this thing in like 45 minutes, and right after I won, I went on Twitter to see what people were thinking about it, and everybody, and I mean everybody, was saying this fight stunk. I couldn't believe it. Unsurprisingly, Divine Beast Dancing Lion. Unsurprisingly, once people started beating, whatever the hell this thing's name is, it went from most hated to mostly loved by a good amount of people. For one, it looks amazing, and the theme in the background is awesome. Maybe I'm uncultured, but in my mind, this is a very Chinese-inspired boss, and if all of Black Myth Wukong's bosses are like this, that would be great. Divine Beast Dancing Lion has one fairly large attack pool that's split among 3 different elements: lightning, ice, and wind. There's also a secret second fight in the ancient ruins of Rao that has a Deathblight phase, but I'm not going to talk about that here. It's actually really fun. At around 75% health, the Divine Beast will begin using its elemental phases, typically beginning with lightning. Each element has its own minor attacks like a lightning bolt, a frostbite swarm, or a tornado, but overall the Divine Beast does the same attacks the whole time. So, if you're good at delayed combos, i.e. Margit or Moog, you'll probably beat this fight in a matter of minutes. And if you're one of those people that actually uses consumable items like the boluses, this is also the fight for you. The only fight for you. I think the one consumable I've ever used is the Bright Bug from Dark Souls 2, but that thing is such an OP item, I don't even know if that really counts. Anyways, the main reason people find Divine Beast so difficult is because in the Lightning and Frostbite phases, all of its attacks have a follow-up, so you need to be extremely cautious about when you attack it, as otherwise you could get stun-locked to death with a single combo. While all that is exceptionally hard to deal with, this fight really climaxes when you get it low and it does its elemental medley. For about a minute, you can't do anything but cling on for life as the Divine Beast rotates between the 3 elements. If you get lucky and it finishes the spasm in its wind phase, you could be well on your way to victory though, as the Beast's wind form is by far the easiest of the whole fight and is where you should try and cash in on damaging it. Reason being, Divine Beast does a great job giving you reprieve windows, most especially in the wind phase because it doesn't have any elemental follow-ups. While it may go under the radar as realistically something like that should be a given, a lack of offensive opportunity is something you may notice was a major complaint for a lot of the bottom end fights in this DLC, as well as most of Elden Ring's main game bosses. As such, Divine Beast is one of my favorite fights in Soulsborne, and the experience of beating it was one of the best moments I had in Shadow of the Erdtree.
The amount of times I rolled too early into the ice phase AoE is outright shameful. It was like something out of a slapstick comedy with how much was happening. I think this killed me more than almost any other boss in the DLC, so I was seething really hard at how I was seemingly the only person struggling to put him down. Everyone's got that one boss, I suppose. I didn't think the camera was nearly as awful as some people did, but I did find it funny that you could see the back guy's butt cheeks if you positioned yourself just so. Number 3, Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame. May chaos take the world! This fight is absolute peak. The setup is the best that FromSoft has ever had for a single boss the way I see it. The entire preceding area is a sinister, frenzy-ridden nightmarescape. Evil woods, one could say. Midra's Mance picks up right where the Abyssal Woods left off and piles on the atmosphere nice and heavy, priming you for who knows what up in the attic. Midra was the biggest mystery in the trailers to me before the DLC came out. I recall that a lot of people thought he was actually the blind swordsman who taught Melania, which would have been interesting maybe, but far less cool than what we did get. The fight has a great fake-out intro, where beyond the fog wall lies a pathetic little guy with a normal enemy health bar who screams in pain like a ninny and tries to ankle bite you. It's only when you pummel the poor guy beyond what he can tolerate that he decides to unleash what little he can channel of the frenzied flame. The intro rules because he does the Forgive Me Zanzibart thing, which is hilariously done by not one but two bosses in this one DLC. I can still find very little explanation as to who Nanaya is, beyond maybe being Midra's wife or something, so as always, feel free to educate us in the comments if you know more than I. The cutscene would probably be a top 3 coolest moment in FromSoft history if they actually showed you the part where he takes the sword out, so that was a bit of a blue ball. Maybe they just don't force their employees to watch snuff films for 12 hours a day like NetherRealm Studios does, in which case I understand the whole have a Foley artist snapping vegetables in front of a microphone approach. Midra himself has an interestingly elegant fighting style for somebody meant to embody chaos, possibly due to Midra's aristocratic-seeming status prior to his confinement. Once Midra fully embraces the madness, things get cranked up to full throttle, although he still retains a very old-school Souls boss feel to him, if that makes any sense. You could drop this guy into one of the first 2 Souls games and he'd still probably work. It's notably easy to stagger him, to the point that I ended up designing my entire approach to the fight around bullying him with cheeky ice-infused charge attacks. You can get one right off the bat with some clever positioning, which scratched an itch in my brain every time I went for it. This is a fight that I could never get frustrated by, save for maybe having to kill his mortal form every time. At least it spawned another memorable voice line in the form of, "The depths of your foolishness!" which is delivered in something I can only call a YouTube poop accent.
Number 2, Bale the Dread. Call me lame, call me a pussy, call me whatever you want. I summoned an NPC for this fight. I got Bale to about 10% health a bunch of times and had a pretty good time, but I felt like something was missing. The preceding area kind of hints to the point of obviousness that you want to summon Egon, so I tried it once and the fight became way more enjoyable. And luckily for me, I think that's a consensus opinion. This is the only fight I summoned for in this playthrough, but if that's what it's like to summon, I get why some people say Elden Ring is the easiest game in this series. I might do a Spirit Ash run now, because I dunked on Bale like he was a nobody. And yeah, he is not a nobody. This dude is a world beater. Well, more like a dragon beater. Bale the Dread is the guy who bested Dragon Lord Placidusax in battle. I like when games do that. You know that dude that kicked your ass? This is the guy that kicked the guy's ass that kicked your ass. A lot of people logically compare Bale to Midir, and while in my opinion Midir is still the best dragon fight, these two are about equal. Bale's arena is on par or even cooler than Midir's, and Bale is possibly the most cinematic boss fight in all of Soulsborne, alongside his eternal enemy Placidusax. But for some inexplicable reason, for me, Midir is just the best. Nonetheless, Bale is about as perfect as a dragon boss can get. Like some of the other legendary Soulsborne dragons, i.e. Calamite or Sin, Bale the Dread makes really good use of his spacious arena. He has multiple attacks in both phases that take up the entire length of it, and he doesn't have any questionable timings to his moves. And that's a big issue the lower quality dragon bosses have, and that's why the best dragon fights are so universally loved. Bale's phase 2 is when things really kick off though, and this is definitely the coolest second phase in the DLC and maybe in all of Soulsborne. He regrows his wings ripped off in the battle against Placidusax and launches a grand attack where he encircles the whole arena and swoops down from the skies directly onto you. Dodging that attack is one of the coolest feelings I've ever gotten in a video game. I'm surprised he doesn't regrow that stump he has though. Maybe it's a placebo, but I'm pretty sure the ripped off leg and head take more damage than anywhere else in his body. I've said it a couple times earlier about how most Phase 2s in this DLC are just the Phase 1s with a couple extra moves, but Bale does it better than anyone else bar the number 1 boss. He does share some of the attacks from his Phase 1, but most of the combos have additions like explosions from the ground, or even whole new moves on top of old combos. But most notably, Phase 2 adds a ridiculous amount of AoEs and spectacle attacks, which add the icing on top of the already substantial amount of flair. Bale the Dread is undeniably among the triad of Souls Dragon Kings, and alongside Dark Eater Midir and Dragonlord Placidusax is one of the greatest boss fights ever made.
I fought Bale without the summon because I thought at least one of us should do it both ways, so we didn't get 9 million comments about either cheating the game or missing out on Igon's legendary monologue of psychotic rage. For the record, I don't really care if people summon, and neither does Miyazaki based on a number of interview comments he's made. I can totally get doing it if you're pressed for time or simply tired of getting cream pie'd over and over by the same guy. That said, people who act like it's exactly the same as not summoning are either coping or farming Reddit karma. As in all things, balance. Number 1. Messmer the Impaler. I'm convinced Messmer the Impaler is the best thing FromSoft has ever made, hands down. Even disregarding the boss fight aspect of Messmer, he's still definitely one of the most interesting characters and coolest looking to boot. As the world's number 1 fan of the Code Geass school of character design, his sickly look is a slam dunk in my book. I even have a giant figure of the guy, sitting slightly to the right of my laptop where I'm typing out this script. This is a fight that I could be stuck replaying in a time loop for hours on end and not even mind. It's addicting trying to get perfect runs going. He's not easy or anything, but it is remarkably intuitive timing and positioning-wise to dodge most of his moves, save for that one combo where he ends with a ground stab that doesn't cause spears to shoot up. Dodging his moves is meditative in the sense that I'm not really panicked at all. My internal monologue becomes closer to the function of a metronome than a fully active human mind. The only other boss that I even put into the same tier as this are probably Gale and Ishin, although even then I'd still have Messmer leading in that bracket. I love the voice acting for this cutscene, but a supremely underrated aspect of the cinematics in his fight is the camera work. That one shot of him from above with the statue of Marika looming behind him is incredible, both visually and for storytelling purposes. In general, Elden Ring is my favorite work from FromSoft as far as the story goes, since it really feels like there's a fully thought out story, full of characters with personalities that bounce off each other in the world they live in. Marika being sort of justified, at least on the charge of genociding the Hornsent, was something I did not see coming at all, but it retroactively explains an insane amount of previously incomprehensible aspects of the lore. Messmer's motives were a huge question mark going into the DLC, since the snakes made me think he was possibly the son of Rykard, who was known for hating on the Golden Order more than almost anyone else in the game. In which case, it would not make much sense for him to be a Morgott-like Golden Order fanboy. I won't get into the full details here, since most of you probably know already if you're watching a video on this topic, but I was really impressed with how they managed to reconcile all this stuff and explain it without just leaving it in vague item description terms. Hardly needs to be said either, but that phase transition cutscene had me creaming in awe. Him and Morgott lap all the other demigods in the swag department no contest. Weirdly enough, I find the second phase significantly harder than the first, which doesn't seem to be the case for anyone else I know. I think I'm just really bad at avoiding the snake moves, since they juke me out a lot. He does take double damage due to weird collision boxes in this phase, or so I've been told, but I didn't get to capitalize on that as much as I should have because I was spending a shameful amount of time flat on my bum. Just scripting this set my blood aflame with passion, and now I want to go back to my rune level 1 run that I dropped when I got to Rykard. Don't worry guys, I'll make some other videos first. Big Daddy missed you all. But yeah, Messmer, love this guy, seriously.
Thank you so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't, and be on the lookout for our difficulty ranking coming out shortly after this one. That's all for now. Deuces.